Hello friendos, it's Bella from the Bookish Badger, and today I'm going to be reviewing my 2017 reading year. I am filming this on January 1st, 2018. That's right, it's 2018 now. Where did that year go, for one? And two, why does the year 2018 just like sound fake to me? It sounds like some way advanced year that shouldn't be here yet, but it's here and maybe I'm the weird one. It's not the year's fault. But anyway, my reading year this year has been pretty darn great. First of all, I read more books than I ever have before. This year, I read 52 books. In the past, I think the first year I did a Goodreads reading challenge, I set it to 20 books, and I just made it, like I eked it in like the last couple of days. And the last year I set it to 22, and I just eked that in like the day before the last day, I think. So this year I wanted to play it safe because I was like, whoa, I just made that one, so I had set my goal to 23, and then I way surpassed that, and I surprised myself for sure. Now, I can think of three major things that can account for my jump in reading this year. I think one of them is that there was somebody in my life in 2016 who hated reading, and I think therefore I wanted to read less, or I just didn't get to read more. But in 2017 that was solved, and in 2017 I discovered audiobooks in, I want to say like October-ish. That sounds about right. And that helped a lot because now I can get so much more reading done in times that I would never have been able to get reading done before, because when you can't do the physical act of reading, it turns out you can still read by listening to it. Isn't that a revelation on my part? And the last thing, of course, is that I discovered BookTube this year. I did not watch BookTube for too long before I created my account, so it's not like I've been watching for years and years and then I finally decided to create my account this year. It's that I discovered it in, I want to say, May of this year, or last year, I guess, since it's 2018 now. I discovered it in May of 2017. You know what I mean. And on top of watching everybody else's content and getting book inspiration that way, I also get book inspiration by having my own channel and creating my own content, because I want to be able to talk about different books with you guys. And don't get me wrong, because I could talk about my favorites all day, every day, really, but I want to be able to talk about other things with you guys, other books with you guys. So that has also inspired me to read more, to read differently, and all of those things. Anyway, now I would like to talk a little bit more about some of my favorite and my least favorite books of the year to really get a feel of what my reading year was like. I'll start with my top 5 least favorites so that we can end on a positive note with this video, but I would like to say as well that it was very hard to choose a least favorite, 5 least favorite books of the year, because I just really enjoyed a lot of the books I read this year. I think that's another thing that made this reading year so great for me, is that I had so few like reading duds. So that was another great thing. But out of my reading year, these are the 5 that I would have to say are in the lower area. Number 1 is definitely the worst, but the rest of them are more like so. Most of them I rated like 3 stars on Goodreads, so that's still not the worst. Alright, my number 5 least favorite book of the year was Noggin by John Corey Whaley. I just didn't like how repetitive this book was and how whiny all the characters were, and that's what really brought down the rating of this book, because the concept is so cool. It's about this boy who had cancer and he dies, but then he gets reanimated because he had his head frozen, and then he is having to go through life being reanimated 5 years later, and he has to catch up and everything. So what a cool concept, but just really not a fan of the characters, so that's why this is in the top 5. My 4th least favorite book of the year was Pride and Prejudice. I'm just kidding, it wasn't Pride and Prejudice exactly. Don't throw the hate. It was Pride and Prejudice, the play by Helen Jerome. Now, there are many different versions of the play. I was in a version of this play this year, and I had ordered the script before I auditioned because I wanted to know what the audition was going to be like going in, and I accidentally ordered this one instead of the version that I was going to be in, and I read this one, and it doesn't even have all 5 sisters. Like, Kitty and Mary are just cut out of the equation, and also a lot of important events are switched around so they don't make nearly as much sense, and I had issues. Alright, these last 3 books I do not have to hold up, but my third least favorite book of the year was The Pursuit of Mary Bennet, a Pride and Prejudice novel by Pamela Mingle. And So, Mary Bennet is one of the sisters in Pride and Prejudice, if you've read the book, and this was sort of a imagination of Mary Bennet's character, what's going on during Pride and Prejudice, after Pride and Prejudice. Like, during that whole storyline, it's focusing on Mary Bennet, but it did not do it too well. Just Mary's character was completely changed, and it just came off as fanfiction, and not good fanfiction either, just bad fanfiction. So, not a fan. My number 2 least favorite book of the year was Percy Jackson and the Olympians: The Ultimate Guide by Mary J. Knight. This was a companion book, and it just was, it's basically what it was is it reviewed the whole Percy Jackson series, just not even like a review, like a synopsis of each book. It was more like, oh, this is this item, and this is this magical creature, and this is everything that you already know about these characters, and we're not going to give you any new information about everything. We're just going to be repeating things needlessly, and it just felt totally pointless, and it wasn't even written by Rick Riordan, and it just wasn't even entertaining version of the information that they were relaying, and it was probably worse because I read it directly after I finished The Last Olympian, so I already knew everything that book was talking about, so it might be better for somebody who hadn't read the Percy Jackson series in a long time, and they wanted to catch up a little before they started, like, the next Rick Riordan books and whatnot. But for me, when I read it, just super duper meh. And my number 1 least favorite book of the year, by far, which is also, by the way, the only book this whole year that I rated 1 star, is Nick and Nora's Infinite Playlist by Rachel Cohen and David Levithan. I love the title of this book so much. I think the title is fantastic, and I also think that it is the only redeemable quality of this book, because the characters are super unlikable. The plot is barely there, if a plot exists. I would argue that it does not. The writing was just, the writing was not only plain, but also just really crude, and there were a lot of scenes that were just, like, completely unnecessary, and the whole book just felt unnecessary. Have you ever just read a book where it's like, this book is unnecessary? Because for me, this book felt like that. Now to move on to my highs for this year, my top 5 favorite books. Coming in at number 5 is going to be Percy Jackson and the Olympians: The Lightning Thief by Rick Riordan. I know that I am super duper late on this series because I just read the first book in May of 2017, and I didn't finish the Percy Jackson and the Olympian series until like October of 2017. So I am realizing that I missed out because this series, and the first book especially, was just so much fun. The characters are such a joy to be with, the plot is so fun, and just this series just invokes the word fun for me, and action-packed, and just awesome, because that's what it is. Coming in at number 4 is going to be Bone Gap by Laura Ruby, and this was my first introduction in my memory to magical realism. I was reading it and I was like, oh yeah, this is contemporary, and then like some fantasy-ish stuff happened, and I was like, whoa, where'd that come from? And I was like, whoa, that's magical realism! whoa! The plot is that there's this small town and these two brothers named Finn and Sean, and one day all of a sudden this girl named Rosa appears in their barn out of nowhere, and then a couple months later she gets kidnapped, but Finn is the only one who knows she was kidnapped, and then everything just goes on from there. And the writing in this book is just so pretty. I would highly recommend this book to anyone who is looking for an introduction to magical realism because it was so cool, and anyone who's just looking for a good book because this is a good book. Number 3 for this year is going to be Norse Mythology by Neil Gaiman. This was kind of a year of mythology for me because I read the Percy Jackson books, which are Greek mythology, and I read Norse Mythology by Neil Gaiman, and that's obviously Norse mythology. That didn't need explaining. Now, Norse Mythology by Neil Gaiman is basically an easier to digest version of traditional Norse mythology. He took all of his stories from real Norse mythology stories and he just made them basically easier to read. And I listened to this one on audiobook, and I have to say, Neil Gaiman writes books that are meant to be read by his voice. He narrates a lot of his own books, and he is so good at it. Plus, it made me want to know more about Norse mythology, as did Percy Jackson with Greek mythology, so whenever a book does that for me, it is a job well done. Number 1 and number 2 were a very close toss-up for me. Just the top 5 really was kind of a close call because, like I said, I've read so many books that I really loved this year, but number 1 and 2 especially was a rough decision. But what I ended up doing is, for place number 2, I chose I'll Give You the Sun by Jandy Nelson. Now, if you've been around my channel for a bit, you probably know how much I adore this book because my first video on this channel was a rave review for this book because it is just one of the most gorgeous things I have ever read. It is about these twins named Noah and Jude, and half of the book is told from Noah's perspective when they are 13, and half of the book is told from Jude's perspective when they are 16. I was not expecting too much going into it, and then I loved it, and it is not only in my top 5 for this year, but probably in my top 5 favorites just of all time because it was so wonderful and I love it so much. And my number 1 favorite book of this year, which was also in my top favorite 5 books of all time now, is Anne of Green Gables by L.M. Montgomery because this book is just so wonderful. I've also posted a rave review for this one, which I will leave in the description box down below if you have not seen it, but the gist of it is that the characters are wonderful, the writing is wonderful, the plot is wonderful. There's nothing about this book that I do not love because it is just such a marvelous piece of work. And if you haven't read it, please go read it because it is just amazing and you are missing out if you have not read it yet. Anyway, that is it for this video. I would love to hear how your guys' reading year went. What were your favorite books? What were your least favorite ones? If you've read any of the same books that were my favorites or least favorites this year. If you had similar opinions or different opinions on them. All of it, any of it, please leave a comment down below. If you enjoyed this video, do not hesitate to give it a thumbs up. Do not hesitate to subscribe for more content coming soon, and I will see you in the next video. Bookish Badger, signing off.